DIYers, what's going on? Mike Borders with the Mike Borders channel. Thank you for watching. We're working on a Mercruiser outdrive lower unit. This is a full rebuild. This is part 3. Let's get started. All right, DIYers, again, back at it. We are at the workstation, picking up right where we left off. Again, we are going to remove the pinion gear bearing. Let's take a closer look and get started. On the left-hand side, you see our drive shaft as well as our pinion gear, our shift shaft and crank. And there's the inside of an empty lower unit. On the right-hand side, there is our propeller shaft. And it's got the clutch dog as well as forward gear. And again, in this video, we are going to replace the internal pinion bearing. And there are the tools. On the left-hand side, that is the removal tool. And on the right-hand side, that is the install tool. Now let's go up top and show you the actual pinion bearing inside the drive shaft cavity, as you can see here. And again, this is where the drive shaft shifts down into and goes through the bearing, as well as the lower pinion gear, and is secured with the pinion gear nut. Now let me scroll in. And in our case, we have 18 needle bearings. I just wanted to show you a close-up view of the current pinion bearing installed. We are now going to remove it. And back to the tools again. On the left hand side is the removal tool. However, we need that washer removed from the install tool, and we'll do that right now. Washer is now removed, and back to the driver rod and driver. You can see some visible thread. It is extremely important to screw that driver all the way on that driver rod until it is properly secured and tight and no visible thread is showing. At this point, I've repositioned the lower unit to the floor because we are going to be doing some pounding with that hammer on that drive, and I wasn't interested in doing that on top of the workbench. So from here, we are going to insert that driver and rod inside that cavity of the lower unit and in position inside the bearing. And DIYers, it is extremely important to have all of your bearings installed and present during the removal process. If you are missing a needle, add some grease to it and reposition it inside the bearing. Again, all needles must be present during the removal process. And I am going to do my absolute best to give you a good view of this, but it will be tough. Again, ever so gently insert the driver and rod to the internal cavity and shift it in position inside the bearing. And you may have just heard that we actually had a few needles fall out, and we grabbed our 2,4-C grease. We're going to grease up these needles and reinstall them. Carefully pull the needles out of the lower unit, and I'll do one at a time, as you can see. And I've got some 2,4-C on my finger. I'll just lubricate the needle, and now let's reinstall them. Next, I ever so slightly grease the needle bearings that these are going to go up against, and carefully shift this in place and roll it. And now I'll use my finger to push these two bearings apart, and I'll install the last one. And the last needle bearing coming in, shift that into place. And from here, I'll just make sure that all the needles are properly seated. And if any look out of place, just carefully grease it and push it back into place. And back to it. As you shift this rod and driver down the cavity, try to align it and go slow, be precise. And I am in position. Let me give you a better look here. And here's a better view of it. Do your best to center the driver on the needle bearings. From here, I'll reposition the camera and hammer this bearing out. However, do not forget your washer. Before we start banging at this rod, we want to carefully shift the washer onto the rod and down the rod and into the actual bearing cup cavity. And again, this is going to help stabilize the rod as we hammer it. And a close-up of the washer shifted down inside the bearing cup or cavity, and that rod is much more stabilized and ready to be hammered. And DIYers, no need to rush this. Be precise and patient. Take a look down below and verify it is removed, and carefully shift up and remove the rod, washer, and driver. Set that in a safe location. I now have the lower unit and stand on the workbench. Let's take a closer look inside. And you can see all the needle bearings, and it looks like the carrier came out in a few different pieces. We are going to now pull all the needle bearings out as well as the carrier. And again, all I'm doing now is retrieving all of the needle bearings. As you can see right here, again, there's 18 of them. Make sure you get all 18 out if your outdrive has that number. And be mindful as you shift all of these parts out, you do not want to scratch or score any portion of that inner case where the gears and clutch dog go. And yes, there's the carrier, and it broke, so I have to verify all the parts come out. There's another part. And there are a lot of needles. And it looks like a couple needles are really deep into the inner portion of the case and in the cavity where your drain port screw is. And now to a close-up of all the needle bearings and carrier. Again, 18. We've got 5, 10, 15 on the lower right, and 3, making 18 needles. And I've also retrieved all of the broken parts of the carrier. I am going to rebuild it to ensure that we have every single part that broke off of that larger portion. And here's the update. I took a few minutes, gathered all the broken parts, and I rebuilt the carrier. And as you can see, there are some cracks right here. There were 3 little pieces on top, and then there was a large piece. You can see the large crack here. And this is the bottom portion of the carrier that gave way. However, there was still enough grip on the present needles and the driver to remove it. In DIYers, this is an extremely important step to ensure you have every single piece of this carrier in the event that you break it. Really for 2 reasons. Number 1, when it comes time to reinstall the new bearing, you do not want any of the old bearing inside that cavity. That will cause havoc on the install process. And number 2, in the event that you leave any of those little pieces inside the lower unit, when it comes time to put everything back together and add the gear lube and turn the engine on, any little pieces of this metal will destroy your inner gears, and you do not want that. Taking a step back, DIYers, from here we actually have to do some maintenance to the inner case. As I was removing that bearing carrier right there, it gave us a heck of a time. And unfortunately, during that process, I made some drill gouges and scores in the inner case. And usually that's not that big of a deal. However, the position of those gouges or scoring are in line with the rubber O-ring that goes on the back portion of the bearing carrier and creates that water and oil tight seal, ultimately keeping water out of the gear case and the gear lube and oil inside the gear case to keep the gears properly oiled and lubricated. And in the event that you are curious and interested in watching us fix those gouges, definitely check out the link scrolling above. We will do that, and we will then come right back to this video and complete the install of the new bearing. We are back with you, and DIYers, that project went well. And to a sneak peek of the inner case, as you can see, no more drill gouges. You can still see where the JB Weld filled in the gouges. We repainted it, and we are very happy with how this turned out. And there is the new pinion bearing. We'll unwrap that. And here is the tool we are going to use. At first glance, it may look a little intimidating, but once we get this all set up and installed on the lower unit, you will see how awesome this tool is. Back to the lower unit, going back inside, and before moving on to the next step, the inner cavity where the bearing itself will be shifted into and put in place, we have to ensure that it is 100% clean of all debris before we move on. Some people use rubbing alcohol. However, whatever you use to clean out that cavity where the pinion bearing will be installed, just make sure it's 100% clean. After spending a couple minutes and cleaning the internal cavity, go ahead and unwrap your new bearing, and you'll notice the top end says this side up. And you see all the needle bearings and they are properly greased. In addition, you see a part number, and that inner cardboard piece must stay in during the entire installation procedure. And that actually has a name. That is a cardboard shipping sleeve, and it assists in keeping all of those needle bearings in place and not falling out as you use that tool to install it. And to a quick overview of the tool itself, it may look like a lot of parts, but it's not really a lot of parts. You have a long threaded puller rod that goes through a nut, a washer, a thick plate, a pilot washer, and down at the very bottom is your bearing installation tool. And right now it's installed backwards or upside down. When it comes time to install that bearing, it will be flipped the opposite direction. And for your convenience, I am going to place all the part numbers to this tool down below in the comment section as well as description section. Back to the lower unit. Let's get this thing installed. I changed camera angles. I'll grab the tool. Be careful. The washer, plate, and small washer all move freely. I'll shift those up flush with the nut. And from here, I'll just unscrew the bottom portion here, and I'll carefully set that aside. And there's the tool in relation to the bearing. And again, this side up, this actually has a smaller machine cut than the bottom side, and that is to assist in this bearing race or carrier itself to be able to shift into that cavity in a friendlier manner. And I will carefully shift the tool into that center cardboard portion, and there it is. Next, coming to the top portion of the lower unit, and that is your drive shaft cavity. And we are going to carefully shift that tool in place. And in relation to that larger pilot washer, as we shift this rod into this cavity, that larger pilot washer is going to go inside that cavity and properly seat itself at the lower stopping point, as you can see right inside there. I'll do my best to give you a good view of this. And the rod goes in. Be careful as you shift this rod in. You do not want it to scratch the inner cavity. And from here, just allow that pilot washer to fall into place. And again, that must be flush with the inner stopping point. And I'll show you a better view of it here shortly. And you want to make sure that this is straight and this plate is properly seated as shown here. To a top view real quick, and again the plate is resting on the top portion of the lower unit. And coming down inside here, you can see the pilot washer deep inside the cavity and resting flush with the stopping point. We're now going to come inside the lower portion of the unit, and you can see the threaded portion of the puller rod extending down inside the lower portion. And right now the rod might be too far down, so we are going to come back up top and screw the threaded rod counterclockwise to raise it. And that will allow us to conveniently and efficiently shift this entire portion here into place and align the thread and start installing the bearing. I have raised it, and again that is going to give us better clearance to shift the bearing and install tool in place to align that thread and continue the install. However, first, some people freeze this. In our case, we're not going to. We are actually just going to lubricate it. This is the Mercury Gear Lube SAE 90, and this is the exact gear lube or gear oil that you install in the lower unit to properly lubricate the entire outdrive. And all I'm going to do is tip it upside down with the cap on, and then I'll unscrew it. And I will use the oil that basically attaches itself to the inner portion of the cap to lubricate the carrier. And no need to overdo it, but you do want it to be lubricated. And I'm only lubricating the outer race. I'm not actually putting gear lube inside where the grease is. You want to keep the two separate. In addition, I'm doing my best not to lubricate the bottom install, because that will be the dry portion I grab as I shift the tool and bearing in place inside the lower unit. And again, grabbing the lower portion or the install tool itself, I will carefully shift this inside the cavity. I've got my left arm up on top holding the threaded rod, and do your absolute best to align it properly. It may take you 20 to 30 seconds. Just do it right. No cross threading. And once it is aligned, I will carefully turn the install tool counterclockwise so it can grab that thread on the rod itself. And we are in, and it is screwing on extremely efficiently, and that's what you want. If it's hard to turn or rotate, unscrew it, realign it, and try again. And to a close-up where we're at right now, you can still see the threaded portion of the puller rod, and then the lubricated or gear oiled bearing, and then the install tool at the base. And this part you want to do by hand. You want to screw that bearing up into the cavity as straight as possible before shifting to the actual wrenches and adding force to pull that bearing carrier up into that cavity. And I am doing my best to give you good light. And again, as you screw this install tool on, make sure you are properly aligned up top with the plate resting against the top portion of your lower unit. And once it starts to have a little tension on the top portion, give it a slight friendly jiggle to ensure that you are 100% properly aligned prior to moving on. Back to the top portion, and I want to show you the configuration as shown here. The plate itself is properly aligned, the washer and nut are in place, and the rod is straight up and aligned as possible. And the top portion here is cut, and you can use a 10mm wrench. And as I do this, I'm going to do my best to give you multiple camera angles showing the procedure up here, as well as watching the bearing itself down below get pulled up and inside the cavity. One last important thing to take into consideration before moving on: make sure that threaded puller rod is at least halfway screwed into that install tool, because in the event that it's just screwed in maybe 1/8 of an inch and you start adding the force to pull that puller up the rod, it might come unscrewed and fall apart, and that's not what you want. To a quick view of the owner's manual steps for our specific serial number outdrive, and there is the pictorial image, and in relation to the letters down here to the parts, and there are all the part numbers right there for the entire tool broken up into pieces. Back to the top, I've grabbed my 10mm wrench, and I'm going to rotate this clockwise. And you may find it beneficial to hold the bottom bearing install tool for about 5 to 10 seconds as you rotate this in place, and it will get tighter as you screw this on. Again, go slow, be precise, no need to rush this. Coming back up top in DIYers, we are all done and it is resting flush with the inner bore. We are now going to unscrew this puller rod counterclockwise. Next, I'm turning it counterclockwise and it is loose. And I can now basically pull up and I'm going to rotate that nut a few inches up. That should do. And I will continue unscrewing the entire puller rod from the lower install tool. And as I do this, I'm applying upward pressure on the lower install tool so it does not fall out of the bearing and that cardboard sleeve. All right, we are loose. I'm going to carefully shift the entire tool up and out and set that aside. In addition, I will pull out that inner pilot washer as shown here. And now I'll go back down below and pull out the tool. And as you do this, just be careful. Again, you want to keep that cardboard sleeve installed in the bearing. There it is. Coming back inside, and I'll try my best to give you a good view of it, and I'll scroll in. And again, extremely important that that bearing carrier is flush with the drive shaft cavity bore, as shown here. I'm carefully sliding the camera in to give you a much better close-up view of the final product. Taking a step back in DIYers, that is it. And when the pressure increased and the tension built as we use that tool to push that bearing up into the cavity for better leverage, I transitioned to an adjustable wrench there. And again, DIYers, that's it. Hopefully this helps. Do us a favor, below the video, you will see that thumbs up icon. Click on that, like the video, subscribe to the channel. Definitely ring your YouTube bell. That would be very helpful to us. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks again for watching.